When the tyrant sheriff punched Dwayne Johnson, he didn't expect him to fight back. Subscribe to find out what happened next and post in the comments, where are you watching from? The sun hung low in the sky as Dwayne the Rock. Johnson's black SUV rolled into the small southern town. Its polished exterior gleamed against the backdrop of worn storefronts and faded signs, the contrast stark and unmissable. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional hum of a passing truck or the distant laughter of children playing in a park. This was a place where time seemed to move a little slower, where the world beyond its borders felt like a distant echo. For Dwayne, this was exactly the kind of setting he'd been hoping for, a chance to step away from the noise of Hollywood and make a tangible difference. As he drove down the main road, his sharp eyes took in the surroundings. There was an old diner with peeling paint on its sign, a barber shop with its iconic striped pole spinning lazily, and a hardware store with a hand-painted banner advertising special deals on fertilizer. It was quaint and charming in its way, though there was an undercurrent of something heavier, an intangible weight that seemed to hang in the air. Dwayne made a mental note of it, but chose to focus on the positive. He was here for the kids, for the community, and to leave behind something meaningful. He pulled up to the school, a modest brick building that had clearly seen better days. The windows were streaked with years of wear, and the basketball hoop in the yard leaned precariously to one side. Despite this, the place buzzed with life. Children were running around, their laughter filling the air, while teachers and volunteers unloaded supplies from a truck. Dwayne stepped out of his car, towering over most of the adults nearby, and his presence was immediately noticed. Whispers and murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Is that? No way! It's the Rock! Mom, it's him! Can I go say hi?" Within moments, he was surrounded by a small group of kids, their eyes wide with excitement. Some held out notebooks for autographs, others simply stared in awe. Dwayne knelt to their level, flashing his signature smile that could light up any room or playground. "All right, who wants an autograph?" he said, his deep voice carrying a warmth that put everyone at ease. The kids cheered, and he began signing notebooks, backpacks, and even the occasional sneaker. A few parents stood by, watching with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. It wasn't every day that someone like Dwayne Johnson showed up in their small town. As he interacted with the children, a man in his late 40s approached. He was slightly balding, with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, and wore a tie that looked like it had been pulled out of a drawer 5 minutes earlier. This was Mr. Holloway, the school's principal. "Mr. Johnson," he began, extending a hand. "I can't tell you how much it means to us that you're here. The kids, the staff, the whole town. We're all so grateful." Dwayne shook his hand firmly, his grip strong yet kind. "Please, call me Dwayne, and it's my pleasure. I'm just here to help however I can." They walked together toward the gymnasium, which served as the centerpiece of the school's modest facilities. Inside, tables were set up with donated sports equipment, books, and art supplies. Volunteers worked diligently, sorting items and setting up stations for the event. As they toured the facility, Mr. Holloway spoke candidly about the challenges the school faced: budget cuts, outdated resources, and the struggle to keep kids engaged in a town with limited opportunities. Dwayne listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "This place has potential," he said finally, looking around. "It just needs a little love, a little care. We can fix this." Mr. Holloway's face lit up with a glimmer of hope. "That's what we're trying to do. But with someone like you involved, we might actually pull it off." As the day progressed, Dwayne spent time with the students, sharing stories of his childhood and the challenges he'd overcome. He told them about his days of playing football, his struggles with self-doubt, and how he found strength through hard work and determination. The kids hung on every word, their admiration for him growing with each story. Meanwhile, across town, someone else had taken notice of Dwayne's arrival. Sheriff Randall Kale sat in his office, a cramped space filled with outdated filing cabinets and the faint smell of stale coffee. He watched from his window as word of Dwayne's presence spread. People gathered in small groups, talking excitedly, their faces alight with something Kale hadn't seen in a long time: hope. The sheriff was a man who thrived on control. For years, he had maintained his grip on the town through a mix of intimidation and manipulation. He didn't like outsiders, especially not ones who came in and disrupted the delicate balance of fear and obedience he had cultivated. "Who does he think he is?" Kale muttered to himself, his jaw tightening as he sipped his coffee. He turned to his deputy, a young man named Jeff, who stood awkwardly by the door. "Find out everything you can about him. I want to know why he's here and how long he plans to stay." Back at the school, the day ended with a small ceremony where Dwayne officially handed over the donated equipment. Cameras flashed, and the local newspaper snapped photos for the next edition. The kids presented him with a handmade banner that read, "Thank you, Dwayne," in bold, colorful letters. He held it up with a broad grin, the gesture touching his heart more than he let on. As the crowd dispersed, Dwayne lingered for a moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. He felt a sense of peace, but also a subtle tension. Something about the town didn't sit right. The wary glances from some of the adults, the hushed whispers when he passed, there was more to this place than met the eye. That night, as he settled into his room at the modest motel on the edge of town, his mind replayed the events of the day. He thought about the kids, their laughter, and their dreams. He also thought about the sheriff, the way the man had stared at him from his car earlier, his eyes cold and calculating. Dwayne had dealt with people like Kale before, and he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. As he turned off the light and lay back on the creaky motel bed, Dwayne made a silent promise to himself. He wasn't just here to make a donation or take a few photos. He was here to make a difference. And no one, not even Sheriff Kale, was going to stand in his way. The next morning, the town stirred to life under a blanket of golden sunlight. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, already up and ready, left his motel room for a quick jog. The brisk air carried the scent of dew-soaked grass, and the quiet hum of the small-town morning surrounded him. As he jogged through the streets, he passed the diner from the day before, its windows fogged from the breakfast rush. A few locals inside noticed him and waved hesitantly. He waved back, his smile genuine, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As he rounded the corner near the park, his pace slowed. A boy, no older than 14, was being questioned by Sheriff Kale near the edge of the playground. Dwayne observed from a distance, his sharp eyes taking in the interaction. The sheriff's towering figure loomed over the boy, who stood with his head bowed, clutching a worn skateboard. Kale's voice, even from afar, carried an unmistakable tone of accusation. "You think I didn't see you? Don't lie to me, kid. You're the one who's been messing around near the store." The boy mumbled something inaudible, his shoulders hunched in fear. Kale stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt, dangerously close to his holster. "I'll ask you one more time. What were you doing back there?" Before Dwayne could think twice, his instincts kicked in. He approached the scene calmly, his presence immediately commanding attention. Kale turned, his brow furrowing as he registered who was walking toward him. "Mornin', Sheriff," Dwayne said, his tone even but firm. "Everything all right here?" "This doesn't concern you," Kale snapped, his lips curling into a sneer. "Go back to wherever you came from. I've got this handled." Dwayne stopped a few feet away, his towering frame easily matching the sheriff's. He glanced at the boy, who now looked up at him with a mixture of hope and fear. "It concerns me if a kid's getting bullied by someone in authority," Dwayne replied, his voice calm but layered with an edge that hinted at his growing irritation. Kale's eyes narrowed. "You don't know who you're talking to, Johnson. This is my town. My rules." "Funny," Dwayne said, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "I thought this was America. You know, where people are innocent until proven guilty." The sheriff took a step forward, his stance aggressive. The boy edged backward, clutching his skateboard tighter. For a moment, it seemed like Kale might lash out, but he stopped himself, his gaze flicking toward a small group of bystanders gathering nearby. The tension was thick in the air, the quiet murmurs of the onlookers adding to the weight of the moment. "Fine," Kale said through gritted teeth. He turned to the boy. "Get out of here and stay out of trouble." The boy didn't need to be told twice. He bolted, his skateboard rattling against the pavement as he disappeared down the street. Kale glared at Dwayne, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. "You just made a mistake," the sheriff said, his voice low and threatening. "Stay out of my way." Dwayne didn't flinch. "If staying out of your way means letting you intimidate kids, then no, Sheriff. I don't think I will." Kale's face reddened with anger, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and stomped back to his patrol car, slamming the door so hard the vehicle shook. The crowd dispersed quickly, some people murmuring their thanks to Dwayne before hurrying away, as if afraid they might be the next target of the sheriff's wrath. Later that day, Dwayne stopped by the local diner for lunch. The place was modest, with faded checkered tablecloths and a jukebox that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. As he entered, the quiet hum of conversation paused for a brief moment. The patrons glanced at him, some with curiosity, others with subtle nods of appreciation. He took a seat at the counter, ordering a simple meal of eggs and toast. The waitress, a woman in her late 30s with a kind smile, seemed eager to chat. "You really gave the sheriff a run for his money this morning," she said, leaning slightly over the counter. "Not many people around here stand up to him." Dwayne looked at her, noting the faint worry in her eyes. "Is he always like that?" She nodded, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Worse, sometimes. Folks around here are too scared to say anything. He's got connections, you know. Makes people disappear if they cross him." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Dwayne frowned, his fingers drumming lightly on the counter. "Sounds like someone who's been in power too long." "You're not wrong," she said, lowering her voice further. "But be careful. He doesn't like outsiders, especially ones who make him look bad." Before Dwayne could respond, the bell above the diner door jingled. Sheriff Kale walked in, his boots echoing against the tile floor. The room fell silent as he scanned the diner, his eyes locking onto Dwayne. Without a word, he strode over and sat down on the stool beside him. The tension was palpable. The waitress froze, her pen hovering above her notepad. Kale leaned slightly toward Dwayne, his voice low but menacing. "You think you're a big man, huh? Coming into my town telling me how to do my job?" Dwayne didn't turn to look at him. Instead, he took a sip of his coffee, the silence dragging out until it became unbearable. Finally, he set the cup down and spoke. "I think big men don't need to bully kids to feel powerful." The sheriff's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the counter. His voice dropped even lower, dripping with venom. "You're going to regret this, Johnson. Mark my words." Dwayne finally turned to face him, his expression calm but unyielding. "You're welcome to try, Sheriff, but I don't back down from bullies." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Kale stared at him for a long moment before standing abruptly. He threw a few bills on the counter and stormed out, the bell above the door jingling violently in his wake. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Dwayne found himself walking through the town again. He passed groups of kids playing basketball on the cracked court outside the school, their laughter filling the air. Despite the pleasant scene, the encounter with Kale lingered in his mind. The sheriff wasn't just a small-town authority figure drunk on power. He was a dangerous man who thrived on fear. As Dwayne returned to his motel, he noticed a patrol car parked across the street. Kale sat inside, his silhouette visible through the windshield. Their eyes met briefly before the sheriff started the car and drove off. It wasn't a retreat, it was a warning. Dwayne stood there for a moment, the weight of the day settling on his broad shoulders. He knew what this was, the beginning of a battle. And while he didn't come here looking for a fight, he wasn't going to run from one either. The next day began like any other, with the town resuming its unhurried pace. But for Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, the tension in the air was palpable. He had been in plenty of tough situations throughout his life, on the football field, in the wrestling ring, and even navigating the unpredictable waters of Hollywood. Yet, there was something unique about this town. It wasn't just about the sheriff or his unchecked power. It was about the silent acceptance of oppression. Dwayne arrived at the school early, eager to dive into the day's work. He was helping with the final touches of the gym renovation, painting walls, assembling basketball hoops, and ensuring everything was ready for the kids to use. As he moved from one task to the next, the teachers and volunteers around him couldn't help but marvel at his energy and dedication. "Does he ever take a break?" one of the volunteers whispered to another. Dwayne overheard and laughed. "Breaks are for after the job's done," he said, flashing a grin that was equal parts charm and determination. By midday, the gym was nearly complete. A group of students had gathered to watch the transformation, their excitement bubbling over as they imagined the games and activities they'd soon enjoy in the refurbished space. Dwayne took a moment to address them, leaning casually against one of the newly installed bleachers. "When I was your age," he began, "I didn't always believe in myself. I struggled, just like a lot of you might. But I learned something important. No matter where you come from or what challenges you face, you can achieve great things if you work hard and believe in yourself." The kids listened intently, their admiration for him growing with every word. Dwayne's stories weren't just about success, they were about perseverance, resilience, and finding strength in adversity. It was a message that resonated deeply, especially in a town where hope often felt like a distant dream. Later that afternoon, Dwayne decided to take a walk through the main street to stretch his legs and clear his mind. He passed by the local hardware store, the diner, and the general store, greeting people as he went. Some waved back with smiles, while others avoided his gaze, their unease evident. He couldn't blame them. Standing up to someone like Sheriff Kale wasn't easy, especially when fear had been ingrained for so long. As he approached the park, he noticed a familiar figure leaning against a patrol car. Sheriff Kale was waiting for him, his arms crossed and his expression as sour as ever. Two deputies stood nearby, their postures stiff and uncertain. It was clear this wasn't a casual encounter. "Johnson," Kale called out, his voice carrying across the park. "We need to talk." Dwayne stopped a few feet away, his calm demeanor masking the tension that simmered beneath the surface. "Talk about what?" he asked evenly. Kale pushed off the car and took a step closer. "About how you've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. This is my town, and I don't need some big-shot celebrity coming in here and telling me how to do my job." "I'm not here to tell you how to do your job," Dwayne replied. "I'm here to help this community. And from what I've seen, your job seems to be making people afraid of you." The words hit their mark. Kale's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he took another step forward. The deputy shifted uncomfortably, but didn't intervene. The tension between the two men was almost tangible, like a coiled spring ready to snap. "You think you can come in here, throw your weight around, and make me look bad?" Kale growled. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with." Dwayne's expression remained calm, though his eyes sharpened. "I've dealt with bullies before. You're not as special as you think." The sheriff's face turned red, his hand instinctively moving to the baton on his belt. "Watch your mouth, Johnson. You don't want to make this worse for yourself." "Or what?" Dwayne asked, his voice steady but firm. "You'll hit me? Arrest me for walking through the park? Go ahead, Sheriff. Show everyone who you really are." Kale hesitated, his grip tightening on the baton. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually lash out. But then he noticed the growing crowd of onlookers gathering nearby, their phones raised to record the encounter. The sheriff's reputation, already tarnished in the eyes of many, was now under even greater scrutiny. "You think you're smart," Kale sneered, "but you're just a big, dumb jock who doesn't know when to quit." Dwayne took a step closer, his towering presence forcing Kale to tilt his head upward. "You're right about one thing," he said quietly. "I don't quit. Not when people like you abuse their power. Not when a community needs someone to stand up for them. So if you're looking for a fight, Sheriff, you'd better be ready to lose." Kale's eyes flicked to the crowd, then back to Dwayne. His chest rose and fell with barely controlled rage, but he knew he was outmatched, not just physically, but in the court of public opinion. Without another word, he turned and stormed back to his car, his deputies following reluctantly. As the patrol car sped away, the crowd erupted into applause. Dwayne turned to face them, his expression softening into a humble smile. "This isn't about me," he said, raising his hands to quiet them. "It's about all of us. We have to stand together if we want things to change." The words resonated deeply, sparking a sense of unity and determination among the townspeople. For the first time in years, they felt the stirrings of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they could reclaim their town. That evening, as Dwayne returned to his motel, he noticed the patrol car parked in its usual spot across the street. The silhouette of Sheriff Kale was unmistakable, his presence a silent reminder that the conflict was far from over. But Dwayne wasn't intimidated. He had faced bigger challenges before, and he wasn't about to back down now. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he stared out the window at the patrol car, his mind replaying the events of the day. He knew the sheriff wouldn't let this go. There would be another confrontation, and it would likely be worse than anything so far. But Dwayne was ready. He hadn't come to this town looking for a fight, but if that's what it took to protect the people here, he would face it head on. As the night settled over the town, Dwayne made a silent promise to himself. No matter what happened, he would stand his ground. The following evening was unusually quiet. The small town seemed to hold its breath as though it knew a storm was coming. Dwayne, the Rock. Johnson sat on the edge of his bed in the dimly lit motel room, lacing up his sneakers. His day had been long, but fulfilling. The school gym renovation was complete, and the kids would now have a space where they could play, grow, and dream. Yet, the lingering tension with Sheriff Kale loomed over him like a shadow he couldn't shake. Dwayne glanced out the window. Across the street, as expected, Kale's patrol car sat parked under the pale glow of a street lamp. The sheriff had been there every night since their first confrontation, his presence a silent but deliberate act of intimidation. Tonight, however, the car was empty. The uneasy quiet outside felt unnatural. Dwayne was no stranger to danger, and years of experience had honed his instincts to detect when trouble was near. Rising to his full height, he stretched and rolled his shoulders, then grabbed his phone and stepped outside. The cool evening air greeted him, carrying with it the faint sound of crickets and the rustle of leaves. He decided to take a short walk to clear his mind. The town was mostly asleep, the only signs of life coming from the faint glow of a diner down the street and the occasional passing car. As he strolled past the park, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His sharp eyes scanned the area, but everything appeared normal, until it wasn't. The attack came suddenly. Two figures emerged from the shadows of the trees, their movements quick and deliberate. Dwayne turned just in time to see the glint of a baton swinging toward him. He sidestepped the blow, his reflexes sharp, and the weapon whistled harmlessly past his head. "Evening, fellas," Dwayne said, his voice calm but laced with a warning. "You sure you want to do this?" The men didn't answer. One lunged at him, aiming a punch toward his midsection. Dwayne caught the man's wrist mid-swing and twisted it, forcing him to drop the baton with a sharp cry of pain. Before he could react, the second attacker rushed in, swinging his own baton in a wide arc. Dwayne ducked, the weapon missing him by inches, and delivered a swift kick to the man's shin, sending him stumbling back. "You guys are making a big mistake," Dwayne said, his tone growing firmer. Before the attackers could regroup, a third figure appeared, Sheriff Kale. He stepped out of the shadows, his face twisted in a smug sneer, and clapped slowly. "Impressive, Johnson," Kale said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I see you've still got some fight left in you." Dwayne straightened, his towering frame illuminated by the dim streetlights. "I don't know what you're trying to prove, Kale, but this isn't the way to do it." Kale took a step closer, his baton tapping rhythmically against his palm. "What I'm trying to prove," he said, "is that you don't belong here. This is my town, my rules, and I'm tired of you making me look bad." The two deputies, now back on their feet, flanked Kale, their faces a mix of anger and hesitation. It was clear they didn't fully share the sheriff's zeal, but were too afraid to defy him. "You really think this is going to end well for you?" Dwayne asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. Kale's smirk widened. "Oh, it's not about how it ends for me. It's about how it ends for you." With that, Kale lunged. His baton swung in a brutal arc aimed at Dwayne's ribs. Dwayne reacted instantly, blocking the strike with his forearm and shoving Kale backward with enough force to send him stumbling. The deputies hesitated for a moment before rushing in, their movements uncoordinated and panicked. Dwayne moved with precision and restraint, deflecting blows and disarming his attackers without causing unnecessary harm. One deputy swung wildly, only for Dwayne to sidestep and gently shove him to the ground. The other tried to grab him from behind, but Dwayne spun and locked the man's arm in a hold, forcing him to drop his weapon. Kale, seeing his men falter, let out an enraged growl and charged again. This time, Dwayne didn't hold back. He caught Kale's wrist mid-swing and twisted it, forcing the baton to clatter to the ground. With a quick, fluid motion, Dwayne shoved Kale back, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. The fight was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Kale lay on the ground, his face flushed with humiliation, while his deputies sat dazed nearby. A small crowd had gathered at the edge of the park, their phones held high as they recorded the scene. The murmurs of the onlookers grew louder, their voices filled with shock and anger. "You're done, Kale," Dwayne said, his voice firm and commanding. "This isn't your town anymore. These people deserve better." Kale scrambled to his feet, his face twisted with rage. "You think you've won? This isn't over, Johnson." But Dwayne wasn't interested in threats. He turned to the crowd, his voice rising above the chatter. "You've seen what he's about. You've lived it. Now's the time to stand up and demand change." The crowd responded with cheers and applause, their collective courage emboldened by Dwayne's words. Kale's face paled as he realized the tide had turned against him. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, clearly questioning their loyalty to a man who had just been so thoroughly humiliated. As the sheriff retreated to his car, the onlookers began to disperse, their conversations buzzing with newfound hope. Dwayne remained in the park for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the departing patrol car. He knew this wasn't the end. Kale would come back, angrier and more dangerous than ever, but for now the town had taken its first step toward reclaiming its dignity. When Dwayne returned to his motel that night, he found a note slipped under his door. It was scrawled hastily on a scrap of paper. "Watch your back. Kale won't let this slide." Dwayne read it, his expression unreadable, and folded the note neatly before placing it on the nightstand. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the quiet street below. The battle was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next. This wasn't just about standing up to a bully anymore. It was about justice. And Dwayne was determined to see it through. The next morning, the town was abuzz with whispers of the previous night's confrontation. Videos of the fight between Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and Sheriff Kale were spreading rapidly, not just within the community, but beyond, reaching social media platforms and catching the attention of local journalists. The footage showed Dwayne calmly defending himself against Kale's aggression and disarming the sheriff's deputies with skill and precision. The crowd's cheers and shouts of support for Dwayne were unmistakable, a clear sign that Kale's grip on the town was slipping. As Dwayne stepped out of his motel, the weight of the town's gaze seemed to fall on him. People on the street nodded or waved, their gestures filled with gratitude and newfound courage. A young boy approached him hesitantly, clutching a notebook and pen. "Mr. Johnson," the boy said, his voice trembling slightly, "can I have your autograph?" Dwayne knelt down to the boy's level, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Of course, buddy. What's your name?" "Jamie," the boy said, his wide eyes full of admiration. Dwayne signed the notebook, adding a short message. "Stay strong, Jamie. You've got this. Dwayne Johnson." He handed it back to the boy, who grinned ear to ear before running off to show his friends. As Dwayne rose to his feet, he noticed a small group of people gathered nearby, their faces a mixture of determination and apprehension. One of them, a middle-aged woman with short, curly hair, stepped forward. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice steady but laced with emotion, "we saw what you did last night. You stood up to him. You showed us that we don't have to be afraid anymore." Dwayne nodded, his expression serious. "It's not just about standing up to him," he said. "It's about standing up for yourselves, for your kids, for your future. This town deserves better than what it's been given." The woman's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "We want to fight back, but we don't know how. Kale's been in power for so long. He knows how to keep people in line." "You've already taken the first step," Dwayne said. "You're talking about it. You're coming together. That's how change starts." Meanwhile, across town, Sheriff Kale sat in his office, his face a mask of barely contained fury. The morning had been a disaster for him. His phone rang constantly, calls from reporters, town officials, and even his superiors demanding explanations for his actions. The video of the fight had gone viral, and the public outcry was growing louder by the hour. Deputy Jeff, one of the men involved in the confrontation, stood awkwardly near the door, shifting from foot to foot. "Sheriff," he began hesitantly, "maybe we should, I don't know, back off a little. The town's turning against us." Kale slammed his fist on the desk, making Jeff flinch. "Back off? You think I'm going to let that outsider come in here and humiliate me? He's the one who needs to back off." Jeff didn't respond. He'd never seen the sheriff like this before, and the truth was, he wasn't sure he wanted to be on Kale's side anymore. The events of the previous night had left him shaken, and the sight of the townspeople cheering for Dwayne had sparked something he hadn't felt in years: guilt. Kale's rant was interrupted by another call. He snatched the phone off the desk, his face reddening as he listened to the voice on the other end. It was the mayor, and she wasn't happy. "Randall," she said, her tone sharp, "what in the world were you thinking? Attacking Dwayne Johnson in front of half the town, and now it's all over the internet. Do you have any idea how bad this makes us look? Mayor, with all due respect, don't, with all due respect, me," she snapped. "This is a PR nightmare. I've got reporters asking if we're investigating you for misconduct. I've got residents calling for your resignation. You need to fix this, and fast." The line went dead before Kale could respond. He slammed the phone down and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He needed to find a way to regain control, and he needed to do it soon. That afternoon, Dwayne was at the park, speaking with a group of residents who had come forward to share their stories about Kale's abuses of power. An elderly man recounted how Kale had extorted money from his business under the guise of extra security fees. A young woman described how she'd been harassed by deputies after refusing to date one of them. Each story painted a picture of a man who had used his badge as a weapon to intimidate and exploit. Dwayne listened carefully, his jaw tightening as the accounts grew more disturbing. When they finished, he looked at the group with unwavering determination. "Thank you for sharing this," he said. "It's not easy to speak up, but it's necessary. The more people who come forward, the stronger your case will be. Kale's been getting away with this for too long, but now it's time to hold him accountable." One of the residents, a young father holding his toddler, stepped forward. "What can we do? How do we fight someone like him?" Dwayne placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "You stand together, you speak out, and you use your voice to demand change. I'll be here to help, but this has to be your fight too. It's your town, your home." As the day wore on, the momentum against Kale continued to build. More residents came forward with their stories, and local journalists began investigating the allegations. The town's social media pages were flooded with posts supporting Dwayne and calling for Kale to be removed from his position. By evening, a protest had formed outside the sheriff's office. Dozens of residents gathered with signs and banners, their chants echoing through the streets. "Justice for our town," they cried. "No more Kale." Inside the office, Kale paced back and forth, his anger boiling over. The noise outside was a constant reminder of his waning power. He glanced out the window and saw Dwayne standing at the edge of the crowd, his presence a silent but powerful statement of solidarity. "Fine," Kale muttered to himself, his eyes narrowing. "If they want a fight, I'll give them one." That night, as Dwayne returned to his motel, he felt a mixture of hope and unease. The town was finally standing up for itself, but he knew Kale wouldn't go down without a fight. The sheriff had spent years building his reign of fear, and he wouldn't let it crumble without a final, desperate attempt to hold on to his power. Dwayne sat by the window, staring out at the darkened street below. He could hear the distant chants of the protesters and see the flicker of their signs in the glow of streetlights. For the first time, the town was alive with the spirit of resistance. But somewhere in the shadows, Kale was plotting his next move, and Dwayne knew that the real battle was just beginning. The night was restless, the echoes of the protest still hanging in the air as the crowd gradually dispersed. The town had made its voice heard, but the tension was far from resolved. Dwayne, the Rock Johnson, sat in his dimly lit motel room, the faint hum of a ceiling fan doing little to ease the charged atmosphere. His phone buzzed with messages of support from people across the country who had seen the viral video of his confrontation with Sheriff Kale. Each message reinforced his resolve, but he knew this wasn't over. Kale was still out there, and the sheriff wasn't the kind of man to go down quietly. By morning, news crews had arrived, their vans lining the street near the sheriff's office. The town was waking up to a new reality, one where Kale's unchecked authority was no longer absolute. Residents were emboldened, sharing their stories with reporters and demanding justice. The once silent majority had found its voice, and it was growing louder with each passing hour. Dwayne stepped out of the motel, his imposing figure immediately drawing attention. A reporter approached him, microphone in hand and camera crew trailing behind. "Mr. Johnson, can we get a comment? What's your take on the growing movement to remove Sheriff Kale?" Dwayne paused, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't about me," he said firmly. "It's about the people of this town. They've lived under fear for too long, and now they're taking a stand. I'm here to support them, but the real heroes are the ones who found the courage to speak out." The reporter nodded, clearly impressed by his humility. As Dwayne continued down the street, he noticed several townsfolk gathering outside the diner. They waved him over, their faces a mixture of hope and determination. "We're going to the mayor's office today," one of them said. "We're demanding that Kale be removed from his position." Dwayne nodded, his voice steady. "That's the right move. Stay united and make your case clear. You have the power now." Meanwhile, Sheriff Kale was in his office, his face a mask of barely concealed rage. The previous night's protest and the mounting accusations against him had pushed him to the brink. His deputies avoided eye contact, their loyalty shaken by the unfolding events. Even Deputy Jeff, who had long been one of Kale's most reliable enforcers, seemed unsure of where he stood. "They think they can get rid of me," Kale growled, pacing the room. "They think they can take my town." Jeff hesitated before speaking. "Sheriff, maybe it's time to step back. Things are getting out of hand." Kale whirled around, his eyes blazing. "Step back? Are you serious? These people don't know what's best for them. They need me." Jeff said nothing, but the doubt in his eyes was unmistakable. Kale's paranoia was consuming him, and even his closest allies were beginning to see it. By midday, the town square was filled with residents holding signs and chanting for justice. The mayor, a pragmatic woman in her 50s named Evelyn Carter, stepped out onto the steps of City Hall to address the crowd. Her expression was serious, the weight of the situation clear on her face. "I've heard your voices," she began, her tone measured but firm. "And I've seen the evidence. Sheriff Kale's actions are under investigation and effective immediately. He is suspended from duty pending a full review." The crowd erupted into cheers, the sound reverberating through the square. Dwayne stood at the edge of the gathering, watching as the town took its first real step toward accountability. But his relief was short-lived. A familiar voice cut through the noise, sharp and venomous. "This isn't over." All heads turned as Kale appeared at the edge of the square, flanked by a few loyal deputies. His face was flushed with anger, and his hand rested on the holster at his hip. The crowd fell silent, the atmosphere thick with tension. "You think you can just throw me out?" Kale shouted. "You think you can take everything I've built?" Mayor Carter stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "Sheriff Kale, you're out of line. You've been suspended. Stand down." But Kale wasn't listening. His eyes locked onto Dwayne, his hatred radiating like a palpable force. "This is your fault," he snarled. "You come into my town, stirring up trouble, turning these people against me. You've got no idea what you've started." Dwayne stepped forward, his movements deliberate and controlled. The crowd parted to let him through, their eyes fixed on the unfolding confrontation. "This isn't about me, Kale," Dwayne said, his voice steady. "It's about you and the choices you've made. The people here deserve better, and they're not afraid of you anymore." Kale's hand twitched near his holster, and the crowd collectively held its breath. But before he could make a move, Dwayne raised a hand. "Don't do this," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's over. Walk away before you make it worse." For a moment, it seemed like Kale might listen. His hand wavered, his expression flickering with uncertainty. But then his pride took over and he drew his weapon. The crowd gasped, but Dwayne didn't flinch. With a speed that defied belief, he stepped forward, grabbing Kale's wrist and twisting it just enough to force him to drop the gun. The weapon clattered to the ground, and Dwayne kicked it away, his grip unyielding. "It's done, Kale," he said quietly. "Let it go." Kale struggled for a moment, but the fight had gone out of him. His shoulders slumped, and he looked around at the crowd, their faces a mixture of anger and pity. The deputies who had once stood by him now stepped forward, one of them placing a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, Sheriff," the deputy said. "It's time." As Kale was led away, the crowd erupted into cheers. The nightmare that had plagued the town for so long was finally over. Dwayne stepped back, letting the moment belong to the people. They had earned this victory. Later that evening, as the sun set over the town, Dwayne stood outside the school gym, watching the kids play basketball on the freshly painted court. The sounds of their laughter and shouts filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension of the previous days. Mr. Holloway, the school principal, approached him, a grateful smile on his face. "You've done more for this town in a few days than we've managed in years," he said. Dwayne shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. This town found its strength. All I did was remind them it was there." As he prepared to leave, a young boy ran up to him holding a piece of paper. "Mr. Johnson, can I get one last autograph?" Dwayne chuckled and knelt down, signing the paper with a flourish. "Stay strong, kid," he said, "and always stand up for what's right." The boy beamed, clutching the paper like a treasure. As Dwayne walked toward his SUV, he glanced back at the town one last time. The lights in the windows, the laughter of the kids, and the smiles on the faces of the people told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a victory. It was a new beginning. And as he drove away, the golden glow of the setting sun reflected in his rearview mirror, Dwayne felt a deep sense of peace. Justice had been served, and the town was finally free to heal. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more like it. Explore our other videos and discover even more inspiring content. Share this video with your friends and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next one.